Hi, I'm Asad Dunner, the founder and CEO of The Unmistakable,s a consultancy that makes diversity everyone's business. And today I'm going to talk to you about how you can become inclusive by design. I'm going to explain what inclusive by design means as we go along. But if we look at the next slide, you'll see a bit of a rundown about what you're going to expect. So I'm going to give you a history lesson. I'm going to start by looking at the background of diversity, the background of inclusion, and how that has worked its way through both in society and within business. Then we're going to look at the present day and why it is that we're all focused on diversity and inclusion. I think in part because of what's happened this year with Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, but also how leadership teams are wrangling with this topic. And then I'm going to look at some practical tips of how you can become inclusive by design using this framework that we've set up called Inclusion by Design. And it's something that we bring to our clients to help them rework and rethink the way that they are building and growing their businesses. So let's start with a history lesson. As you'll see on the next slide, a big globe in the background. There's a couple of things to note here. And the first is, as you'll see on the next slide, is that diversity and inclusion is older than World War II. There was an executive order in the US that looked at how to bring armed services and personnel back into the workforce, namely when they were Black. And it was about making sure that people who had served in the army could reintegrate into society and also provide opportunity within the armed services, regardless of someone's race, colour, religion, or national origin. And this was something that was being thought about many, many years ago and has been thought about all over the world. Now, if we think about workforces mobilizing and how they've moved around the world, on the next slide, you'll see a picture of indentured laborers. These are people who have traveled the world for economic need. And I am one of them. That is my heritage. My father moved from India to the UK in the 70s. And we moved here because we saw a better economic life here. We also moved here because of the cultural ties that both India and the UK had through the empire. And this is nothing new. People moving around for economic need and the mix that makes within society is well documented. And here you can see a picture of some of the indentured labourers who travelled over to, I think it was Nairobi here, to look at how they could build a life there. In some countries, as you'll see on the next slide, there's even a word for it. So in Germany, the word Gastarbeiter literally refers to a guest worker, someone who is foreign or a migrant worker, and they moved to West Germany between 55 and 73 to help rebuild the country during post-war. And the thought around Gastarbeiter was always that they would return back home. A lot of them came from Turkey. Other countries had similar programs: the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And it's been long documented. And so when you think about how that worked and how workforces were becoming more diverse and inclusive, as we'd call it today, you could see that there were economic and cultural shifts happening that were impacting the workplace, in part because the workplace was shifting around the people that were coming into certain countries and the needs that economies had. Now, on the next slide, you'll see a small segment from a book that talks about the year 2000. And it talks about how in the US in particular, and this book I think was written back in the 70s or 80s, we were looking at how businesses could fuel growth. And it was all around how businesses, particularly in the US, would be able to continue to prosper and continue to grow. And as you can see in some of the bullet points there, there was a need to reconcile, or a suggestion that if we could reconcile the conflicting needs of women, work and families in the workplace by the year 2000, then we would have a more prosperous economy. And similarly, if we could integrate Black and Hispanic workers fully into the economy, then we could thrive and move for growth. So this book is decades old and shows that these tensions that we have today about how do you increase diversity in the workplace, how can you make your marketing more representative, are not new. And I think that's really important to stop and think about, because we often think it's new. As an industry, lots of people who work within diversity inclusion feel like their jobs aren't necessarily respected. At board levels, You have people saying, well, what kind of impact can a head of D&I have, and where should they sit, and is it just a signpost? But these are old, decades old theories and thinkings that we need to be taking into account. So you might be wondering, well, who am I? And why am I talking to you? So just a little brief interlude to me. There's a picture of me on the next slide where we took home the award for Best BAME Business, or BAME Business of the Year at the Great British Business Awards. So The Unmistakable is a consultancy that I founded 2 years ago from this very room. We then took an office, and now we're back. It's funny how the world works. But we help companies become inclusive by design. I'm going to come on to talk about that. But my background is as an Asian person, but also as a gay person. And as I became more senior in my career, I realized that I was the only one like myself round the table. And whether that was I was at a board or whether when I was the director of communications for Pride in London as a volunteer, and Pride in London being the third largest one-day event, but also a big celebration of LGBT culture in the UK. I just found that often I felt a little bit different, and that felt quite awkward, and I wasn't quite sure how to use that within the workplace. And I thought I wasn't the only one who felt like that. So what if I could create a business that could harness that difference and use that in a way that could help drive growth for the clients that I knew wanted some help, knew weren't quite sure what to do, but definitely had the right intention. So that's who I am. And I mentioned Pride. And Pride is a social movement. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that social movements have usually been grounded in protest. And so when we think about diversity and inclusion, we often think, well, maybe we'll march at Pride and we can have a rainbow flag and we will have rainbow lanyards, and that shows that we are tolerant and accepting. But we have to remember that these social movements, not just Pride, but now Black Lives Matter, have been grounded in protests, have been grounded in people who want to push the status quo, people who want to push for equality. And as I mentioned with Pride, if we look at the next slide, when business catches up, what happens then? And I'm sure people watching this might be thinking, well, we do march at Pride and we're doing something, but what does that mean? Now, one of the most powerful things to think about when it comes to Pride is that it has to be done on the community's terms. The LGBT community goes to Pride for certain reasons. They go to push, and we have to unbundle some of that stereotyping that happens where LGBT is all one big community. Absolutely right. But within that, the trans community have very different rights that they're pushing towards versus a gay man, for example, who seemingly in society has more equal rights. And this is a picture there where you can see how Pride has moved on from the picture you saw on the last slide, which was more of a protest and an argument, into Tom Daley on a bus sponsored by Barclays with people looking up and seeing this as a great spectacle. So businesses have really caught up to the fact that they need to become more inclusive, and marketers in particular are seeing opportunities around it, but I think struggling. And if we look at the next slide, we can see a bit of a summary of what I've just talked about, which is the push factors that happen within society. So the executive order that I mentioned, the affirmative action, the government mandates, the quotas and legal changes that I imagine a lot of people who have with HR colleagues or their CEOs are thinking, how can we create small changes or interventions within what happens to mandate change? And then at the same time, you've got society pulling us forward, pulling us towards a more diverse and inclusive future that's fueled by Generation Z, who have very different expectations about diversity. You've got technology allowing us to connect, allowing global communities to come together, and obviously changing expectations. And that can feel quite overwhelming and quite daunting for people who work within marketing and communications. So if we look at the present day and look in the next section of my presentation, let's just talk about what's been happening in 2020, because I'm sure, like you, like me, you're at home. You're probably thinking it's been quite an overwhelming year. Certainly from where we're sitting, our business has been booming, and we're very lucky about that. But people are feeling burnt out, and then I guess they're not quite sure what's next. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the system, which for anyone working in marketing sales, it knows how damaging or how difficult that can be to navigate. And I wanted to touch on how we see that's come to be and what we've seen over society. So over the course of this year. So if we look at the next slide, and I think back to March, April time, back in March, I think lots of businesses were thinking, we're going into lockdown, how are we going to survive? What's that going to look like? And then we had early reports that people were being disproportionately impacted by COVID. So in media, we were hearing the term BAME a lot, but we have to break up that term BAME to mean Black, Asian, and minority ethnicities. And the reason why I break that up is because as an Asian person, I wouldn't necessarily categorize myself as BAME, because the experiences of a Black working class woman will be very different to mine as a middle class Asian man. But by grouping us together, is there a disservice that's being done to both communities? And often it's said that that term is being used by a white audience to categorize and move things through, but actually the nuances within that are important for marketing are being missed. So that public awareness of the term BAME came from the fact that we were seeing disproportionate impact of COVID on BAME communities. Black people were dying more, Asian people were dying more, they were more on the front line through the NHS, and all of a sudden we're having this public debate about the differences that a pandemic is having on society. And then obviously, if we move on to the next slide, and I'm not going to play the video, but we saw the video of George Floyd being murdered in the US, just rip through society really, and really showcase that inequality and that the damage that has been done from years of not, I guess, grappling with race and understanding how that has an impact on the workplace. So we had all of the history that I talked about in the previous section, which looked at some forms of affirmative action. We had a lot of progress and have had a lot of progress and continue to have a lot of progress around gender equality, but racial equality feels like the next frontier that people need to face. And if we look at the next slide, you can see what happened in a very short period of time, which is on the left. Global interest in search in racism before George Floyd's murder was largely the US, Western Europe, Russia, Australia, a little bit of South America. But then in a very short period of time, the whole world had woken up to racism and had started to talk about it. And that is quite an exciting moment, but also quite a troubling moment for perhaps global leaders who are thinking, how does this impact my business and what should I do? And if we look at the next slide, we see that just in the first half of this year, the interest in the term diversity and inclusion spiked by 100%. And these are Google search trends where you see people are going, I need to do something about diversity and inclusion. And as a business that has been running for 2 years, we've very much been in the eye of that storm. So what I wanted to talk about just now, before I talk about, well, quite literally, how can you grapple with this and what structures and processes can you put in place? I wanted to talk about a Goldilocks analysis of brands and how they responded to Black Lives Matter, because I've had a lot of clients come to me and say, did we get it right? Our internal communication was such and such, our external was such and such. What do we do now? We felt like we had to react. And I just wanted to offer a little bit of the way that I saw them and what comes next. So what you'll see there on the next slide is a statement. Now, you might not be able to guess, and if we were doing this interactively, I would invite people to guess who this statement might be from. It's actually from Microsoft, where he talks about increasing representation of culture and inclusion, engaging the ecosystem, strengthening communities. These are all bold and big statements that are backed up there by $150 million of D&I investment. But does it do enough? And does it show actually some very tangible steps that are being taken? Not just that, but big sums of money that are being suggested and pledged right now in the context of COVID can be felt to be a little bit misguided if there's no action off the back of that. So that's a response that's too cold. On the next slide, you've got a response that I thought was slightly too hot, which was the response by Nike, where they said, for once, don't do it. And that was talking about, don't be racist. And this was picked up and supported by some of their competitors, and lots of marketers applauded this. But actually, did it trivialize what this is about? And did it put the brand first and foremost in the conversation? And younger generations at home, as well as slightly older ones, have got all of this time to look into Nike's policies, to look into actually what are they doing for people of color? How does their supply chain impact the way that they are? And this is, I think, some of the prickly conversation that people need to have right now, which is some business practices have been built on bias, have been built on treating different communities differently. And for me, this was one that felt slightly too hot and was more about PR. And then on the final slide, this response is just right-ish. So this was a response by Ben & Jerry's that has a history of protests and putting their money where their mouth is. On their website, they talk about and they provide resources about learning more about the history of racial justice in America. For me, this felt like a step in the right direction because they were being helpful. Now, there was certain backlash around this based on how they have worked with migrant labor in the past, and that is to be addressed. And I think that's something that any brand leader or any leader more generally needs to think about, which is if you're going to put your business on the front line and use it as a vehicle to promote diversity and inclusion, you have to be prepared to be unpicked and to be criticized. And that criticism is only to fuel the brand and push it further and make it better, rather than thinking about it as a PR tactic. So we've talked about the history, we've talked about now, and you're probably thinking, right, Asad, well, tell me, how can I become inclusive by design? And on the next slide, you can see that inclusion, or being inclusive by design, which is a philosophy that we believe at the Unmistakable, it's a business that we're trying to build, is about covering or including everyone. It's non-discrimination and done deliberately rather than by accident. And I would say that is the real trend that we're seeing in 2020, which is people are being deliberate about their efforts towards diversity and inclusion, rather than hoping that it might happen or relying on a few members of staff based on who they are to push the agenda forward. So there are four steps to be inclusive by design, and you can see those on the next slide. You can see them on the slide after this. Just before we get there, I'm going to talk about the becoming inclusive by design is about the cultures, teams, and ways of working that are inclusive by design, and then making sure that it spans silos and discipline to create organizational change. And again, this is something that I think marketers say, well, I want my advertising to be more reflective. I want my communications to be more representative. But then when people dig a little bit, we see that actually the truth within the organization doesn't match. So then HR leaders are tackling that internal change that's needed. And that's why becoming inclusive by design needs to span the whole organization. So it was a little bit preemptive, but let's get there now. The 4 steps, I say to better sleep, because we're hearing that a lot of our clients are losing sleep over this, but 4 steps to becoming inclusive by design. I'm going to talk through each of these 4 one by one. So there's recognize, which is about looking at the things you can't see when you're in it. If we just go back to the previous slide, I'm going to talk through all the steps in one go. So refresh is about refreshing your brand to be fit for society today. Represent is about who you want to serve internally and bringing new voices around the table. And respond is about getting to that point where you feel confident and you're prepared to talk about matters related to diversity and inclusion. So talking about recognize, on the next slide, you can see a picture of people diving into a swimming pool. A lot of what we do with our clients is helping them to see the things and identify the blind spots within their brand that they might not have seen. Now, sometimes that's structural because brand managers move around, because the tenure of marketing directors isn't as long as it used to be, so people don't carry the history and know the history that the general public will be chomping at the bit to find out if they want to, or if they think you've taken a step wrong. So we help by looking at history, interviewing stakeholders, understanding the true history of a brand from an external lens, which helps us to pinpoint some of the areas that you might not know when you're in it. Onto the next slide, when we look at how to refresh brands, we look at how do you carry some of that thinking and what we've learned into the brand purpose, into the brand statement, into the tone of voice, all in a way that makes your brand fresher. And we run different workshops in the way we do this. We work with different planners and strategists on this. Onto the next slide with represent. This is possibly one of the most exciting things for the clients that we talk to, which is a service we have called the workshop, which is where we bring together new voices around the table to help critique and build creative before it launches. So when we've run this for different clients, we have helped them to see certain areas of their campaign that might not have come up because the people or the agencies that they're working with don't have a representative table, don't have different people who are looking at it from different cultural lenses. And one of our clients said this is the best research and planning tool that they've ever used because it's really opened not just their eyes, but we've helped them to open their colleagues' eyes up to a different way of seeing things. And I think if anything, the power of marketing communications in shaping how people see themselves in the world means that we have a responsibility to have more representative faces in our industry and in the work that we do. And the workshop is one small step with I would say, disproportionate outcome in the impact and the messages and the learnings that we can bring to the clients that we work with. And then finally, on the next slide, you'll see respond. And that is about responding and taking campaigns out there in a way that that is very mindful and that has been thought through. Now, there's always going to be something that goes wrong. I think it's just unfair to project or promise otherwise. But taking that step out there, using your brand as a force for good, as a way to talk about inclusion, as a way to create better society, I would argue, needs to be prepared for. So we help with messaging frameworks and thinking through crisis protocols and also picking up issues as they come along. So just to recap then on the next slide, if you want to sleep better today, there's 4 things that we can help you with in terms of becoming more inclusive by design. That recognizing, then refreshing, representing, and I can't understate how important that is, and finally responding with confidence. And finally, just to talk about on the last 2 slides, this whole thought that we have is about making diversity everyone's business. So you might be sat there today thinking, I totally understand this, I buy into it, I need to get the buy-in from other people. And only when organizations can make sure that diversity is something that everyone is accountable for, because it impacts all areas of society and all areas of business, much like digital was thought about 10 years ago and has come to be today, diversity is that next point. So that's it. It's all about making diversity everyone's business. And then on the final slide, if you do have any questions or wanted to get in contact, then here's a flash up of the details, and it would be remiss of me to not mention some of the things that we've done, which is Best in Diversity and Inclusion for the Drum and Best New Agency of the Year for Oystercatcher. So thank you for your time. I hope you've been able to take away a little history lesson, a little reflection on today, and finally some practical steps on what you can do to become more inclusive by design.